Enough time on this bench teaches you that people do not always arrive in court carrying only what the paperwork describes. On paper, it was a simple municipal nuisance, 3 unpaid parking citations totaling $240, the kind of matter that usually closes in 60 seconds flat. A fine, a stamp, a dismissal, and the next person steps forward. But the file that Inspector Quinn placed on my bench that morning felt heavier than the weight of the paper itself. Quinn doesn't waste my time. When he gave me that subtle, almost imperceptible nod, I knew this wasn't going to be a morning for routine traffic court. I knew, before the clerk even opened her mouth, that I was dealing with a specific kind of character, the kind that assumes the rules of the road, and by extension the rules of society, were written for other people. Then I heard her. It wasn't the tentative shuffling gait of a defendant who had spent the night worrying about how to pay a fine. It was the sharp, rhythmic, and deliberate tap of expensive heels on linoleum. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention, it demands it. Every step was a declaration of status. She entered the courtroom not like someone appearing before a judge, but like a dignitary arriving at a gallery opening. She was in her late 20s, dressed in a tailored blazer that cost more than the average monthly rent in this city. Her hair was pulled back with a precision that bordered on surgical. Her posture wasn't nervous. It was rehearsed. It was the posture of someone who had never had to apologize for taking up space. I sat back in my chair, adjusted my robe, and prepared myself. This was not just a case about parking violations. This was a case about who she thought she was, and who she was about to discover she was when the world stopped bending to her name. The courtroom fell into a strange, expectant silence as she approached the podium. She didn't look at the other defendants. She didn't look at the clerk. She looked at me, not with the anxiety of someone fearing judgment, but with the mild, simmering impatience of a customer waiting for service at a department store. She rested her hands on the wood manicured, rings that caught the light, skin that had never known the rough grit of manual labor. She was ready. She had her story, she had her confidence, and she had no doubt that this interaction would be short, polite, and entirely in her favor. I looked down at the $240 worth of tickets, then back at her. The test had begun. The clerk called the name Isabella Harrington. The sound echoed, a name that carried significant weight in this city, a name usually reserved for charity galas or headline news, not the municipal court docket. She didn't hesitate. She glided to the podium with the grace of someone who expected the world to part before her. The way she handled the paperwork was revealing. She didn't hold it like it was a legal notice, but like it was a dry cleaning slip she was annoyed to be holding. It was clear she felt this entire exercise was beneath her station. I looked down at the file. 3 tickets, all within the same week, all parked in a loading zone that was clearly marked. It was a classic case of convenience over compliance, someone who had decided their time was simply worth more than the city's ordinances. When I asked her if she acknowledged the citations, her answer was immediate, devoid of any attempt to actually check the facts. "Your Honor," she started, her voice smooth, practiced, and lacking even a hint of genuine concern. "My assistant handles these things. There must have been some miscommunication. It's obviously an administrative error." I've heard that specific sentence 1,000 times in this courtroom. The administrative error defense. It is the favorite sheet. They always have a supporting cast of invisible people ready to take the fall for them. It's a fascinating psychological reflex, isn't it? To outsource the blame for one's own basic negligence. I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to see if there was a flicker of genuine confusion or if it was just pure, unadulterated deflection. It was the latter. She didn't look at me with the respect a courtroom requires. She looked at me with the tired, bored eyes of someone who just wanted this inconvenience to be swept away by a wave of my hand. She wanted me to stamp the paper, nod, and let her return to her world, a world where parking laws are merely suggestions for people who don't have better things to do. I set my pen down slowly. I didn't rush. I wanted her to feel the weight of the silence. I told her, very gently but with an edge of steel, that in this room, assistants didn't stand before me. She did. The air in the room changed slightly. The polished, bulletproof confidence she had walked in with finally hit a wall, my wall. She wasn't used to hearing the word no, and she certainly wasn't used to being told that her carefully constructed world of buffers and managers held no currency in this jurisdiction. I could see it then, the faint tightening of her jaw, a slight involuntary flush creeping up her neck. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the dawning realization that the script she had written for this morning was being rewritten in real time. She realized that I wasn't going to play the subservient part she had cast me in. I wasn't the bureaucrat who would just wave her through. I was the judge, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, just a defendant. The game had shifted, and she didn't know the rules. She didn't just speak, she performed. Isabella braced her manicured hands against the podium, not to lean, but to center herself as if she were about to deliver a verdict on the court itself. "Judge," she said, her voice dropping to that specific, practiced pitch of someone who is accustomed to being listened to immediately. "I think you should know who my father is before we proceed any further." There it was, the golden key, the get-out-of-jail-free card she had likely been holding in her pocket since the moment she decided to ignore that loading zone sign. Most people watching would expect me to flare up, to let my temper show, to play the part of the indignant judge. But that's not how justice works, and it's certainly not how you dismantle entitlement. Anger is a weakness. Anger admits that the other person has managed to rattle you. My response was entirely different. It was a profound, hollow sense of disappointment. I didn't reach for my gavel. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set my pen down, a gesture that, in my courtroom, is the equivalent of a gunshot. It signaled that the formalities were paused. I looked at her, and I saw the invisible second half of her sentence hanging in the air like smog. What she was really saying was, before you apply the same standards to me that you apply to the common person, you should understand why I am not them. We can skip the accountability phase. "I am certain your father is a fine person," I said, keeping my gaze locked on hers, ensuring she understood that I was not intimidated. "But in my courtroom, my interest is in you." She didn't blink. She merely tilted her head, a fraction of an inch, as if she were pitying my ignorance of the social hierarchy. "My father is Governor Harrington," she stated, her tone suggesting that I had surely just made a terrible mistake in failing to recognize her pedigree. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room holding its collective breath. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. I could hear Inspector Quinn shift his weight behind me, a subtle, almost imperceptible rustle of his uniform that sounded like thunder. In the gallery, the people waiting for their own cases, the broken leases, the petty thefts, the simple grinding realities of life froze. They were looking for a sign. They were waiting to see if the name Harrington was a password to bypass the law. The air in the room was thick with the question, is she untouchable? And the answer, the only answer I could provide, was about to be heard by everyone. My father is Governor Harrington. The name dropped like a lead weight in the center of the room. The silence that followed was immediate and visceral, the kind of quiet that settles over a courtroom when everyone present instinctively understands that a gamble has been made. I didn't reach for my gavel. I didn't raise my voice. Anger would have been too easy, and frankly, she didn't deserve my anger. Anger is a reaction. What she deserved was reflection. I sat back, folding my hands on the bench. I took a slow breath, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of her claim sit there, naked and exposed. I thought, in that heartbeat, of my own father, an immigrant who arrived in this country with little more than his labor and a deep, unshakable dignity. He didn't arrive with a surname that opened doors or a title that excused his mistakes. He taught me that respect is not a crown you inherit, it is a floor you scrub clean every single day. You earn it. You don't announce it like a title to get your way. I looked at Isabella. She was waiting for me to panic. She was waiting for the gears of the court to grind to a halt, for the administrative error to suddenly transform into a misunderstanding that could be swept away with a polite nod. She expected the law to step aside because of who she was related to. That, to me, was the real crime. Not the parking tickets, those were just evidence of a habit. The crime was her absolute, unwavering expectation of exemption. "Miss Harrington," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the heavy air, "I am sure your father is a remarkable man. But he is not the one standing at this podium. You are. And right now, you are not a governor's daughter. You are a woman who, on 3 separate occasions, decided that the rules written for the rest of this city simply did not apply to her. I didn't let her look away. I made her acknowledge the reality, not the reality of her status, but the reality of her actions. I asked her a simple question that I knew would cut through the polish. Tell me, what do these 3 tickets represent to you? She answered, without a second of hesitation, $240. There it was, the transactional nature of her existence, laid bare for the entire gallery to see. To her, everything in the world had a price tag, and everything could be bought or cleared away by the right people. She didn't see the choices. She didn't see the arrogance of her own behavior. She just saw a nuisance to be paid off. I saw the first flicker of something real in her eyes, not the rehearsed confidence, but the first true moment of discomfort. The foundation was starting to crack. "No," I said, and I allowed the word to occupy the space long enough to matter. "They represent three separate choices, three separate days on which you parked where you understood you should not, three separate decisions not to address the consequences." That answer reached her. I could observe it reach her. People assume self-reflection always arrives with a crash of cymbals. It often begins as a flicker, a small, subtle interruption in the expression someone wears for the world. I saw that flicker, so I decided to widen it. I wanted to see if there was a person buried under the armor of the surname. I asked her to tell me something about her life, not about her father, but about her. That question genuinely surprised her. It is remarkable how often people who have been surrounded by power are addressed only in reference to their family name, their title, or their usefulness to someone else's image. She blinked. For the first time that morning, she did not appear impatient. She appeared unprepared. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, the wall she had erected began to show its first true fissure. She told me she worked for her father's foundation on youth literacy programs. I will be honest, that surprised me. Not because families with resources don't engage in philanthropic work, many do, often for the optics, but because I had already begun constructing a very specific, cold picture of Isabella in my mind, and that detail interrupted it. Human beings have a way of doing that. They disrupt the simple, cynical conclusions we form about them. A judge who cannot allow that interruption will eventually stop seeing people altogether. I told her that literacy work was meaningful. Something shifted in the room when I said it. She relaxed, just a fraction. She told me her father held high expectations for her, and she had been moving between 3 cities during the past month, treating the tickets as an oversight because her schedule had been, in her words, impossibly. She stopped herself then, realizing that impossible schedule was just another way of saying, I am too important to follow the rules. Busy does not park the car, I said. You do. Inspector Quinn produced a sound behind me that was very carefully, not a laugh. The tension in the room softened, just a little. Then, the back door opened. Governor Harrington entered my courtroom and took a seat quietly in the gallery. No announcement, no entourage filling the center aisle, no theatrical entrance. He simply sat down. That registered with me immediately. He did not move forward to identify himself, did not pass a note forward, did not request a sidebar, did not interrupt the proceeding. He sat and watched. Isabella did not know he was present. Her back was to him. In that moment, I understood something important. He wasn't there to protect her. He was there to observe who she would choose to be when she believed she was standing alone. I made the decision not to alert her. Some lessons cannot be delivered from the bench. They have to be encountered honestly. When you said I should know who your father is, what exactly did you intend by that? The question hung in the air, stripped of any professional niceties. It wasn't an inquiry about her legal defense. It was an inquiry into her moral compass. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't the silence of arrogance anymore. It was the silence of a person who suddenly realized they were speaking a language that no one in this room understood or cared about. She stood there, the expensive blazer suddenly feeling like a costume. She looked at me, searching for an exit strategy, a phrase, a title, a connection, anything to close the gap between her reality and the reality of my courtroom. I didn't give it to her. I held her gaze until she was the one who had to look away. She was physically shifting, the rehearsed confidence bleeding out of her shoulders. She was finally, agonizingly, about to tell the truth. I think, she began, her voice losing its polished, haughty edge, I think I meant that I'm accustomed to things being managed for me. The honesty of that admission was like a sudden cleansing gust of wind. It was the first time she had stopped performing. She was finally acknowledging the invisible architecture of her life, a life built on the labor of others who smoothed the road before she even had to walk it. I watched her, and for a split second, I didn't see a governor's daughter. I saw a young woman realizing, perhaps for the first time, that she had been living in a curated exhibit rather than the real world. And is that serving you well? I asked. I wasn't just talking about parking tickets anymore. I was talking about the life she was building, a life of gilded cages and outsourced consequences. I wanted her to see the absurdity of it. I wanted her to realize that when you stop managing your own small details, you stop managing your own moral integrity. You become a passenger in your own life. She looked down at the podium, her manicured fingers gripping the wood tightly, not with the arrogance of entitlement, but with the white-knuckled tension of someone facing their own reflection in a mirror they'd avoided for years. She knew the answer. She just didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. It is a comfortable fiction, I continued, to believe that life is a series of things to be managed by other people. But that is not a life, Isabella. That is an exhibition. And here, in this room, exhibits do not hold court. People do. She was quiet now, truly quiet. The kind of silence that happens when the static of a lifetime of privilege finally stops. She looked at the floor, then back at me, and for the first time I saw the humanity I had been digging for. She wasn't just a political prop or a name on a donor list anymore. She was a woman realizing she had been playing a part she didn't actually like. "I am not here to ruin your day," I said, lowering my voice so the whole room had to lean in to hear. "I am here because you are a person with potential, and potential is wasted on people who never have to learn how to change a tire, or pay a bill, or face the consequences of a bad choice. You have been protected, yes, but you have also been stunted. And that is a different kind of poverty." I motioned to the clerk. "We are going to recess for a moment, but before we do," I looked toward the third row. The governor shifted, his eyes meeting mine. There was no politics in his expression, no plea for leniency, no command. Just a tired, human recognition of the situation. I held his gaze for a second, a silent acknowledgement between two people who understood that what was happening here was bigger than a parking fine. I turned back to Isabella. "You might want to turn around." She looked at me, confused. Then slowly, tentatively, she rotated. When she saw him, her breath hitched. It was a sharp, audible sound that cut through the room. The governor wasn't smiling. He wasn't yelling. He was just looking at her, with the expectant, patient eyes of a father, waiting to see if his child would finally, truly, stand up on her own 2 feet. The transformation in her face was instantaneous. The last traces of that polished, rehearsed arrogance evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. She realized, in that singular, terrifying moment, that she was not standing before a judge who would be swayed by a name. She was standing before her father, the one person she didn't want to see her as a failure. She stood there, paralyzed by the gaze of the one person whose opinion she actually valued. Her father didn't rescue her. He didn't explain anything away. He didn't perform outrage on her behalf. He simply stood there, a father who had allowed his daughter to face something real and had watched her choose honesty over position. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. It wasn't about the governor anymore. It was about the woman standing at the podium who, for the first time, was entirely responsible for her own choices. I turned my attention back to the files. It was time to close the matter. "Miss Harrington," I said, my voice steady, stripped of the earlier friction. "Accountability is not a punishment to be avoided. It is the foundation upon which your character is built. You have spent your life being managed, protected, and insulated from the friction of reality. That is a dangerous way to live, because when you finally strike the wall, you won't have the strength to stand back up." I ruled. The fines would be paid in full, no reduction, no negotiation. The law, I told her, doesn't offer discounts for lineage. But that wasn't the end of it. I looked at her, searching for that flicker of self-reflection I had seen earlier. "I am ordering you to volunteer at the Providence Community Center," I announced. "Not as the governor's daughter, not as a representative of a foundation. You will go there as an ordinary person. You will sort books, you will shelve inventory, and you will listen to the people who work there. You will learn that service is not a speech or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It is the repetition of small, humble acts that make a community function." She looked at me, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. I thought she might fall back into the habit of defensiveness. But she didn't. She nodded a slow, genuine, and surprisingly heavy movement of her head. She looked at her father, who gave a single, sharp nod of approval. He wasn't pleased with the situation, but he was proud of the choice she had made. It was the most important lesson she would ever learn in my courtroom, and it didn't cost a dime. She gathered her papers. Her movements different now, less performative, more intentional. She didn't march out. She walked, fully aware of the space she occupied.